The inner city neighbourhood of West End in Brisbane is undergoing a process of rapid gentrification. Gentrification is a transformation of an urban neighbourhood from its working class or disadvantaged roots to a more affluent or middle class locality. Gentrification is a global phenomenon, and it's affected most major cities in the global north and an increasing number of cities as well in the global south. It's a contested process. While it can bring vibrancy and revitalisation to inner city neighbourhoods, it's also responsible for the wholesale displacement of many original residents. West End, along with South Brisbane, is located on the southern edge of Brisbane's central business district, enclosed on three sides by the Brisbane River, forming a rough peninsula. The original Indigenous inhabitants called the area Kurilpa. The early settlement of West End in the mid to late 1800s was by labourers and dock workers. These were joined by other migrants, including a large number of Greeks beginning in the early part of the 20th century, followed by Vietnamese migrants in the 1970s. Until gentrification commenced in West End in the early 1990s, the neighbourhood remained largely working class with one of the lowest socio-economic rankings in Brisbane. Like similar inner neighbourhoods in other Australian cities, West End has changed rapidly over the past 25 years. If there was a turning point in the fortunes of West End, it was a 1988 World Expo hosted in Brisbane, which transformed the adjacent South Brisbane area from dilapidated wharves, adult cinemas and boarding houses to a cultural, culinary and increasingly expensive residential precinct. You know that area now as South Bank. In most cases, gentrification occurs as a slow process, and its beginnings are barely noticeable, except perhaps by long-term residents. The first wave of gentrifiers are early pioneers who move into an urban neighbourhood, attracted by cheap rents, urban character and location. These early-stage gentrifiers are students, artists, musicians, anarchists and other nomads and radicals. They are often no more affluent than the existing residents of the area and have a strong desire to live in a way that respects the existing social environment, even as they are changing it. We can call this first wave of gentrifiers the rento-gentrifiers. South Brisbane's newfound respectability and West End's growing reputation as a hip place to live, thanks to the rento-gentrifiers, meant that property prices steadily rose over the next 2 decades, taking it from one of Brisbane's cheapest neighbourhoods to a progressively more expensive one. Although prices increased, West End's housing stock remained predominantly small timber workers' cottages on small blocks. As prices rose, a new second wave of bottom-up gentrifiers began to move in and renovate these character houses. They retain the neighbourhood's perceived authenticity by remaining sensitive to time and place. These architecturally sympathetic home renovations have become commonplace in West End. However, the proportion of rental dwellings in West End remains the highest in Brisbane at 59%, almost twice that of Greater Brisbane, reflecting its diverse and transitory population. There's still a significant but decreasing number of low-rent boarding houses in West End, a visible presence of homeless and precarious white and Indigenous people who use the parks and riverside areas and congregate around the central retail precinct. It's not just the residential areas that are gentrifying. In the main retail precinct, Boundary Street and Vulture Street, there are still a few original small businesses such as key cutters, greengrocers and a traditional shoe shop. However, these businesses now sit alongside more stylish outlets like independent coffee shops, bookstores, a fixed-wheel bicycle shop, a craft beer outlet, vinyl record stores and a growing number of vintage clothing outlets. These very obvious signs of gentrification mean that both the population and the culture of West End is changing quite rapidly. But the historical residents still retain a particular stake in the neighbourhood, from Indigenous residents, a few representatives of the early Anglo-Celtic working class settlers, and a significant but ageing remaining population of Greek and Vietnamese migrants, as well as the homeless, artists, students, and more recent affluent gentrifiers. The final stage of gentrification is well underway in West End. This occurs when the so-called rent gap reaches a point where large-scale development of land becomes profitable. In this more top-down stage, property developers enabled by local and state governments begin to build large apartment blocks and retail complexes, generally with little reference to the original culture or architecture. These developments exploit the existing culture of the neighbourhood as marketing tools to sell their developments as part of a hip or bohemian culture. In actual fact, the entry of these players usually spells the end of the culture they are commodifying, as the regional inhabitants and early gentrifiers become priced out of the market, particularly in the rental market, as well as culturally sidelined. This is perhaps the most overtly controversial stage of gentrification. In the case of West End, it is met with vocal resistance. Retail outlets change to accommodate a wealthier and often more conservative clientele. This can also mean that the marginalised people who had been allowed to exist in places like Boundary Street also find themselves pressured in subtle ways to move on. In West End, you can still find evidence of the various layers of settlement and gentrification. Boundary Street in particular is still a vibrant and diverse public realm where different communities rub shoulders daily. However, change is coming quickly, and it remains to be seen how much of West End's important history is retained as an asset for the whole city once the gentrification process is complete.